So, greetings, everyone. This is Rob Ciampa. I want to welcome you to Reimagining Customer Success as a Strategic Growth Engine. And I'm going to introduce my co-speaker in just a moment here. But for those of you who are joining, please, by all means, introduce yourself in the chat. If there's any questions, feel free to raise a hand, interrupt, or also put your question in the chat. And I want to dive right in and talk about the importance of today's topic. So, as I mentioned, I'm Rob Ciampa, and I've been involved in sales and marketing for some time now. And I've run sales organizations, I've run marketing organizations, I've run product. And oftentimes, my biggest advocate and the person I rely on the most is going to be the head of customer success. And when I went and launched my own venture, we started diagnosing companies. And what we found is that oftentimes, what we deem are customer success issues, or even on the support side, support issues, are in fact not customer success and support at all. There's something else. And we'll talk about that during today's call. But I had the chance to work with Eric Peterson several years ago, and during the span of my career, probably the finest customer success person I've ever worked with. And so when I launched my venture and I diagnosed companies specifically for issues in performance and competitive performance specifically, Eric became my go-to partner when there were issues there. I actually bring him into my clients to go through and rebuild customer success organizations, or more importantly, to get a sense of where it all comes into play. So, Eric, if you want to quickly introduce yourself, and then we'll jump into the pre-sale.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for that, Rob. It sounds like I owe you a nice bottle of wine for the flowery words. Like Rob, I've been working for a long time at early days on the engineering side, but the last 25 years of my life has been on the customer ops side. Last 15 in customer success or similar type roles, and learned a lot over those years about trust and how company trust impacts how your customers view your business, and we'll get to some of that later in the presentation.
Okay, thanks, Eric. All right, so let's discuss our agenda quickly. We're going to talk about competitive advantage. We're really treating customer success as a growth engine, but also a foundation for customer advantage. We'll quickly discuss why customer advantage is one, it's hard to achieve, and I would argue it's even harder to sustain. I've looked at over 300 companies in terms of competitive advantage and looking at how they actually perform. And there's a lot of areas where they haven't invested in customer success is one of them. We'll talk about why it's critical. What I liked about working with Eric is his definition of what it means to be mature in customer success. And he's going to introduce the customer success maturity model, which is really a way for customers to gauge where they need to be at what point in time. He's also going to discuss how to build a world-class team. And that's going to be really important. A lot of the organizations I'm working with, and surprisingly, even ones that are mid-market, haven't really built their team the way one would expect. And we'll talk a little bit about that. And then what's going to be important is what's the AI impact? And we're going to look at the AI impact both in terms of what companies are doing with respect to their customer success tools, or what their customers are doing when they don't have good customer success. So we'll discuss that as well. So this was an interesting data point because of my business. I peruse the papers every day, and the financial, basically the financial papers, the business papers, and I get a sense of what issues companies are having. And recently, and this is actually almost every day, whether it's the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, most of the reporting now is from companies that are getting into trouble. Either they're missing their number, or they've got customer churn, they've got competitive threats. So this whole issue of competition is nothing rare. In fact, most organizations are really susceptible to it. But the level of problems these days is probably the highest I've seen in the several years I've been doing this. And so we'll talk about what that comes into play. So what does it take to be competitive? And again, motherhood and apple pie, but there's actually more to it. One is, a lot of companies is their market strategy in place, and this can be fairly complicated. They'll bring in a lot of high-end consultants to determine what their strategy is. And oftentimes, if you're going to succeed, your strategy ultimately has to make it all the way to execution. And that's going to be pretty important. But we're not going to cover a whole lot of strategy today. The other surprisingly is product strength. And organizations may think, hey, I've got the best product in the world, everything else. There's a lot more to a product than just, hey, your features and functions. And Eric's going to talk a little bit about that in the maturity model and the role of product and customer success. And oftentimes this tends to be overlooked. Customer alignment is a big deal. So much emphasis is put on, hey, it's sales and marketing, but there's a whole lot more to customer alignment, both before the sale and after the sale, and we'll get to that. But more importantly, is the company's capabilities. And so this particular presentation, although we're focusing on customer success, the reality is we're also, and Eric's going to go into, does the company actually have the capabilities here when we talk about the maturity model? So these factors come into play to be competitive. But don't forget, sometimes the low-hanging fruit of your competitive advantage really has to deal with customer alignment. And that becomes a really important piece. Eric, are you seeing the slides yet? Okay, perfect.
I'm good. Thank you.
All right. Like I said, I'll edit that part out. All right. So given the importance of customer success, why isn't it strategic? Good question. I don't think a lot of C-suite people really understand the economic impact. They say that they do, and we can produce statistics all day long. You blow customer success, you're gonna blow the top line, you're gonna blow the bottom line, and that becomes a really disappointing thing. And Eric will talk about some of the stuff, and how do we keep these customers? How do we keep them happy? And how does it all align? So we don't have to spend a whole lot of time here, but the reality is we're all well aware of what this means. Surprisingly, I see some statistics in the marketplace where people say, "Oh, yeah, we're all these companies are investing heavily in customer success." I'm not necessarily seeing that at the level in terms of customer success. Where I am seeing it is trying to turn customer success into a sales machine versus really making the customer do amazing things. So oftentimes the gap between your great product and giving the customer superpowers is your customer success function. And we'll talk about that. So reality is expectations are different now. And I think the expectations that we see among the companies I survey and their customers, expectations are sky high. They want, if they're spending this money, they expect a lot out of you. And even that, it doesn't mean customer success should be tied to saying yes to everything, and Eric will cover that. But the reality is the expectations are really high, which means the patience is very low. The noise and choice have exploded. We have so many solutions in so many areas that customers are actually doing a lot of their research before they even show up for sales. AI and automation significantly raised the bar. This isn't just a flash in the pan. You're going to see it's far more important. And what you'll learn is product alone isn't enough. There's a whole lot more to your company's success in the marketplace, not just the product, but everything around the product. And we'll also find out loyalty has been redefined. Just because they like their account manager doesn't mean they're going to stick around. What does loyalty mean? And then ultimately it comes back to customers having more power. So how do companies create customer success issues? They treat it like customer support. I know, Eric, this is one of your hot buttons, and you and I used to have late night calls on the difference between your success and support, and you'll be talking about this. And so I see that a lot. I'm also seeing customer success. Hey, get the follow-on sale, get the follow-on sale, get the follow-on sale. If you have everything right, the follow-on sale, the upsell, the cross-sell should happen automatically. Customer success isn't based on your metrics. It's based on theirs. And
That's yeah. I just want to pause you there because what you said right there is really really true. If you're doing all the other things amazingly well, the sale just the the expansions and the renewals just happen by themselves, and people are focused on those two things and not doing the 12 building blocks below them to make sure they happen seamlessly.
great point, Eric. And silo it instead of integrating it. And this is this is when Eric and I started working together. It's like, no, this is even marketing has a role here. So, back when, and he roped me in as well. And then, again, going through this, it's not a one-off interaction. It's think in terms of the entire journey and the life cycle, and give the team the power. This has becomes critical. And I see so many organizations focus on product features, functions. The way they oftentimes combat competitive threats is basically through features and functions as opposed to let's give better support. And I've given a number of talks this year on go to market, and all of a sudden, go to market like AI is the buzzword, in the present marketplace. But what does go to market mean? And of the go to market leaders, and I interviewed folks about 2 weeks ago, 25 C-suite folks about go to market. Not one of them, and I'm sorry, Eric, you can throw a rock at me, had customer success in their go to market. I mean, Eric, are you seeing that?
I am, yeah.
Yeah, it's
I
just
mean, there's two schools of thought that are very prevalent in about CS today in the market, and one of them is this near support activity where you're intervening on behalf of the customer to keep them happy, right? And then there's this other sort of prevalent track around almost like an inside sales team, back to inside sales to try to drive renewals and expansions. And there's a lot of companies that are small that don't have a big book of business to do expansions with, right? And those CS folks, instead of again going back to those building blocks, which we'll get to, are doing other activities that aren't going to end up with customers having a great deal of trust for your business.
Yeah. Does that mean you're seeing, if you look at KPIs and comp plans on the customer success side, are you seeing more of them tied to sales versus, NPS and customer sat and other types of things?
There's a transition to those sales numbers, and it's the splits I'd say fairly even amongst those. But 5 years ago, it was much more heavily shifted towards sort of those behavioral analytics, and now it's more towards the numbers.
Okay. Yeah, interesting trends, and that echoes, the stuff that I'm seeing as well. And then finally, before I turn it back over to Eric, it's really important. And I got a call from a CEO friend of mine who had concerns. This was about a month ago. Concerns about his customer success team. There was increased customer churn, and he asked me, "Is it time to get rid of my head of customer success?" I said, why? He went through the issues. It's like, it didn't appear that way. So oftentimes, and I want to emphasize this, what you think are customer success issues, yeah, maybe something else. I mean, we're seeing customer churn, decreased product adoption, limited upsells and cross sells, as Eric just mentioned. It becomes sort of a sales function. Uh, Low net revenue retention. I know, Eric, you're going to cover some of this, and even if it's not the customer, if you got high CSM turnover, that's an indication that something's wrong. And then all the other things, lengthy mean time to detection, mean time to repair. These are symptoms. But before we get the root causes, Eric, can you talk a little bit more about the symptoms that you're witnessing with your clients?
Yeah, I mean, you've got a whole bunch of them listed up here. I mean, some of them, you've got product issues down there below, and that's an interesting one, which I'll cover on the quality side and the thoroughness of functional completion on the other side. But those are also a couple of areas that I'm seeing challenges where teams are just struggling because the quality is not high enough, and customers get very frustrated. Or, we live in this world of lean startup. The book by Reese about sort of minimal viable feature that those features never get completed in some cases, and that's another source of big frustration.
Yeah, it's gonna, and we'll get in. Yeah, as you said, we'll be getting to that, but I couldn't agree more. I think oftentimes looking at an organization holistically, which is where I spend my time, is sometimes let's get through these symptoms. And if you're a C-suite leader, don't react to symptoms. You've got to really spend time getting to the root. And it could be product issues, it could be sales and marketing issues. We'll talk about that. If your sales team, and there's so much pressure, if they're selling features that don't exist, that becomes Eric's problem. So,
Uh, I have literally had sales leaders say that to me.
uh,
I sold it. It's your problem now.
yeah, big,
Well, you
big
sold a
challenge.
banana and we only sell oranges, so gonna
Yeah.
have to
And
make some
yeah,
magic
I would argue,
fruit
Eric,
salad.
that's a management issue. That's a C-suite issue. That's a CEO issue. And
I agree. I agree. And eventually that turns into a boardroom issue.
yeah. And we know how those can sometimes resolve. And then last but not least, there's a whole lot more. We could spend an entire session on this, is training deficiencies and enablement. And if we think we're throwing sometimes the customer success, baby out with the bathwater, oftentimes we're not only underinvesting in customer success, we're underinvesting in training and enablement. We'll talk about some of those facets as well. And we'll talk about when you don't do it right, when we talk about the customer's use of AI, that becomes an issue. So, Eric, turning it over to you.
Yeah. So, if I had to reduce customer success to a single word, it's this. It's trust. Trust that your product works. Trust that onboarding gets customers to value quickly. That support's there when they're needed. That you as the vendor are invested in the success and the outcomes that your customer needs. And when that trust breaks, even a little bit, customers don't complain. They disengage. They ghost your CMs. And they start taking those calls from your competitors that have been ringing them that they've been ignoring. So the framework we're about to talk about, it's not just about process. It's about where trust gets built or lost. And ultimately, this framework enables the growth engine of your business because, if you don't trust your car mechanic, you're not going back there to get your car fixed, right? So you don't. If your customers don't trust you, they're eventually going to churn and go somewhere else where they can get that trust. So let's start with this simple premise that customer success is where trust either compounds or collapses. And most CS strategies don't fail because they're bad ideas. They fail because there's trust broken somewhere in the system. And that those breakdowns happen into three kind of zones: misalignment internally for all the teams, fragmented data. You have a very difficult time getting to where your customers are in their journey and what their sentiment is, and then execution strain from overloaded CS teams, overloaded support teams who maybe are underfunded based on the complexity of your product. And eventually, you don't just lose logos, you lose leverage, and that leverage is proof points for sales, internal credibility issues, negotiating power with your customers, investors if you need those, and ultimately momentum on upsells and expansions. Because if your trust is intermittent, customers are going to wait to expand until they feel happier and better that you can deliver.
Yeah, Eric, on this point, misalignment oftentimes is attributed to sales and marketing. And that it's a valid thing. And again, I think it's more of a symptom of a leadership issue above sales and marketing. But when you talk about misalignment with customer success, what we found in when we have sales and marketing misalignment, we find the emergence of happy metrics. So marketing will say, well, I generated all the leads and everything else. And everybody's happy, right? Even though the reality is there are storm clouds on the horizon. Are you seeing happy metric behavior on the customer success side? Or is it too hard to hide on customer success?
It is not too hard to hide. I'll talk about happy metrics when I get to production
Okay.
and the fallacy of three nines, which is where most SaaS teams try to get to. And if they get there, everything's good, right? I'll talk about why that's not true. But yeah, I
Perfect.
mean, there's many of these metrics. If you peel back the covers, there's underlying data that if you're tracking it, you'll learn more about maybe things aren't as rosy as they look. But we're all managing against numbers, and some of us, some teams don't have the time to go dig deeper because they just don't.
Right.
Some teams don't want it because they're afraid what rock is going to turn over under that rock. All right, next slide. All right, so I'm going to talk about this maturity model, and this model is not specifically about the customer success team in and of itself. It's about the umbrella of cross-functional teams that really support customer success for your entire business. And this model is going to tell you one thing: how well can your organization build and protect customer trust at scale? Think of this like climbing a mountain. Each level gives you more visibility, more leverage, more stability, ultimately more opportunity, but only if the foundation's strong. At low maturity levels, CS is reactive, trust is episodic, and pretty fragile. And that's true in a lot of very small businesses, startups. A lot of them start that way. And as you advance, up the levels, here are as they listed here down the levels. Trust becomes more operationalized. And it's built into how you're onboarding, how you're supporting, delivering features and functionality, and ultimately how your business grows. And the companies at the top who are doing this really well don't necessarily do CS better. They've just made trust fundamental to how they operate internally.
Do you also find the companies that do it well end up getting a little bit, I don't want to say lazy, but are they not looking at enough? Are they revisiting their models? So what are you seeing for best practice on the big picture
I,
here?
I think, Rob, if you're doing this incredibly well, you've got leaders at all these cross-functional teams that frankly are maniacal about customers being successful. I mean, literally, they're like me, they're a little bit crazy, and they're willing to do whatever it takes to make sure that customers are getting what they need and they're getting value from your product. And so, at its foundation, this is an operating system for protecting and compounding customer trust. And in a competitive market, trust is the most valuable commodity that you have as a business. All right, next slide. So product quality, trust starts here, right? I mean, not in a kickoff meeting, not in a sales call, not in a welcome email, but when customers get their fingers on your product for the first time, that's when trust starts. And when bugs go unresolved or performance issues lag, users don't think, oh, it's just engineering issue, they'll fix that. They think, can I rely on this product? Have I partnered with the right company? High product quality, builds trust quietly. It's a deposit in the trust bank. And low quality erodes trust pretty visibly.
So
And
Eric, you've worked with startup companies and you're also a member of Microsoft's team in customer success. So very, very different ends of the spectrum. And so let's just for a moment address the startup because we'll have some startup people, watching the video. And we hear a lot about MVP, minimum viable product. And it doesn't necessarily, it's going to be lacking some things, maybe lacking quality. What's your guidance on product quality for startups?
well, I think quality itself is a non-negotiable item. You get some leeway if you're a startup by your early adopters because they understand what they're signing up for generally. But if the same problems exist over a long enough period of time, their frustration level goes up. And I'll cover that a little bit more in the next slide, which is the product one. Don't go to the next slide yet, but
Oh, sorry.
but there's a method that you can utilize, which I'll talk about, to sort of understand where the hot points are for a customer. Because if you're a startup, you can't fix every bug. You just can't. There's always this tension between functional delivery and fixing existing bugs, and functional delivery and functional completeness. Because you may have 15 MVPs, MVFs, really minimum viable features running within your product as a startup, and you've got to decide which of those get more love on every release cadence. And that there's a method to do that as well, which I'll talk about. There's a lot of methods to do that, but I'll talk about one that I've used pretty successfully. So just back to this one, as if you have poor quality, every crash, every performance problem, every reporting error, general failure, that's a trust withdrawal. And, it's a compounding problem because it impacts all the customer operating teams. Engineering has to do hot fixes, more support calls come in, more production issues occur. CSMs are managing the firefight around all of these things. And so it limits those other teams from doing great work that can move the business forward. Okay, next slide. All right, I'm gonna say this because I really think at the end of the day it's true. But customers don't buy features; they don't buy your product. They buy the belief that your product is going to meet them where their needs are today and stay with them as they move forward and the market moves. That's what they're buying. They're buying a partnership with you to deliver to them to run their business. And so if you've got missing capabilities because you've got a bunch of MVPs running that force painful workarounds, or you're delivering roadmap surprises, which is, hey, we're going to deliver this feature here. Oops, we can't. We're going to deliver it next quarter. Sorry. All those things create doubt. Doubt is a trust killer. And your CSMs are seeing these gaps early, and if their voice isn't loud enough or big enough, influencing product direction, ultimately what you're building is a path to churn, right? If you don't fix those things. So in my experience, having CS teams know the top 3 most important bugs every customer needs fixed, and the top 3 most important features or feature enhancements they care about, is incredibly valuable in building trust with those teams, assuming you got your product team leaning in and looking at those 2 heat maps. Because then you can very tactfully say to your chief product officer or product owner, hey, here's the heat around all the bugs with all the customers we've talked to. I mean, everybody's going to have something on there, and if your CS team is well skilled, once they see some warmth developing on some of those issues, they can sort of guide the witness, as it were, and sort of get more folks to say, yeah, I really want that bug fixed, so that everybody gets a little bit of love on the next release and the next release, and just keep rinsing and repeating that. And the same thing on the feature side. It's a way for you to tee up your product team with, hey, there's this new problem we didn't even know about that people are having. We need a new feature. And that's gold to a product team, because they can come in, listen to what the problems are, and then go build out features. And so, at the company that Rob and I, worked together at, one of the things that we did, which was amazing, my chief product officer would come back to those customers after listening to their problems. I would hear, here's the features I need. And he would say, that's wonderful, but I really need to know the underlying problem so I can build a feature around what the actual problem is. Which was absolutely the right thing to do. So he would go and listen, and then he would come back a few weeks later, 2 to 4 weeks later, with Figma, with wireframes about the features where there was heat. And he'd get immediate feedback from customers, which was, if you know anything about Lean Startup and Reese's book, amazing. No engineering dollars spent, immediate feedback from customers. And if I would say 75% of the time those features were spot on. 25% of the time it was a redo. Come back in a couple of weeks. Here's the updated version of that. But it let us get full validation on the value of a feature before it ever went into engineering's hands. And we knew once we came out with that feature, those customers were going to be ecstatic, because not only did they get a feature they really need, their fingerprints are all over it. And that behavior right there, that cycle of love, it's impossible for customers, for your competitors to break that cycle. They're not giving that love. They're not. All right, onboarding execution. So, Rob, you touched on this a bit earlier. Onboarding is where the promises become proof, right? And trust is most fragile here, as we all know. If onboarding is really manual or delayed, has hiccups, or it's unclear, customers don't just get frustrated. They start to question whether you're the right partner for them, right? And you've set the trajectory for your relationship, unfortunately, really low at that point, and it can be overcome, but it's the wrong way to start.
Yeah,
And so
even with, and we see this even with some of the smaller clients that have a self-serve product. We can talk about, complex implementations and ERP systems and everything else, and we
yeah,
think about onboarding there, but you're also dealing with onboarding, with products that should be relatively simple, and it's self-onboarding. So, Eric, thoughts there?
Yeah, I mean, you need the next thing on my list to talk about is just the prevalence of AI and the ability to build videos, without a talent and a voice, really, right? And so, those onboarding for those types of products need to be at the fifth grade level. Teach a fifth grader how to use your product. If you aren't doing that, you're probably missing part of your audience, and that's the level you need to be at. I used to tell the folks that work for me, my mom's 73 years old. Explain it to her, right? And she's passed away, but she'd be about 80 now. So this was a while ago. But you know what I mean? Just the folks who maybe aren't as technically advanced as we kind of live in this world of everybody we talk to is deep into technology and understands so many things. Everybody doesn't have that level of experience, and that's where I think some teams get stuck. Rob, is they drink maybe a little too much of their own Kool-Aid, and they need to invite their mom to come use their
Yeah,
software. Right?
exactly.
Like seriously, like the product team needs to invite all your moms to use your self onboarding software and see how many of them get stuck.
Yeah,
If it's
exactly.
zero, you're amazingly well done. Ship it.
Yeah, it's funny because I had a marketing guy working for me at one point, and we do messaging exercises, and he'd always add an additional exercise. What would you tell Aunt Bertha? And so it's exactly all right. Makes sense, Eric.
No, go back one. I got one more thing. So so there are tools available to help make this process a lot easier. I mentioned some of the AI stuff. There's in-app tools that you can use like Pendo, which I'll cover in a few slides, which support in-app nudges, journeying, personalization, and also support your ability to see where your customers are going and where they might be getting stuck. But at the end of the day, you're the experience for the customer should be what they should grok out of this is you guys have done this before. You know what you're doing. You're experts, and you're partnering with me to make sure I get the value I need and the outcomes I need. And the last bit is re-onboarding is a thing that most companies are horrendously bad at, and every company I've ever worked at is bad at it. Which is you get a customer for 4 years, they have 40% turnover because just nature of the world after 4 or 5 years. Who's teaching their new folks how to use your product?
Great
Nobody.
point. Great point.
And that's having AI hopefully will enable a low cost way for businesses, vendors to provide the training that those new hires need that gets them into a strong place to become advocates. All right, support. Support is your brand under pressure when things go painfully wrong, and it's really when trust is on the line. And every minute a critical issue is sitting unresolved, is a hit against trust. But it's not about just solving the problems that customers are having. It's about how quickly you can solve them, how clearly, how transparently, and transparency is a really important thing. And how much ownership you can take while doing it. Customers need information to run their business. If they've got a big problem with your software, and they've got some critical deadline, and you can't fix their problem, and you don't tell them, they're going to behave one way because they're expecting you to deliver. If you say, "Hey, I've got 5 other critical issues," let's say your product is in a regulatory environment, and there's a couple of regulatory reporting problems that are in front of this customer's problem that has just popped up, and you tell them transparently, "Hey, I can't solve your problem until Friday because these other critical things are ahead of you. And if you have these same problems, I would move you to the top of the list as well to say, okay, I get it. I'm not excited that I have to go 3-4 days, whatever it is, to get to that place, but it lets them, internally decide how they're going to manage around the problem they have until Friday comes and you give them an answer.
Yeah, what's interesting about your signals here is when I've gone in to do a turnaround, and there's the weekly management meeting, and you'll have KPIs or whatever is being used to measure overall performance. And when there are issues, oftentimes I wasn't seeing a lot of the signals that you had here. We brought the signals in, and these stats light everybody up. So, what's happening on support side, just are we having escalation issues? What's happening here? And when we raise these issues, I can't tell you the shock on the CEO when the CEO is finally seeing this. It was available to him or her the whole time, but now that they're seeing it on a weekly basis, it becomes, customers become, the forefront of things.
Yeah, we'll touch on escalation rates a bit when we get to sort of the hiring stack. But they may have a hiring problem where they're just not hiring enough technical people on their technical support team.
Great point.
All right, next slide. Production operations. This is a near and dear to my heart kind of problem, just given the downstream challenges production ops teams can cause. It's the trust foundation nobody talks about until the app's down in production and nobody can log in, right? Most execs don't see this production ops as a CS issue. They see it um, as a IT issue or a tech ops issue, whatever they call their local team. Until churn starts, and then they're asking their CS team why the customers are churning. Well, because the app was down 12 times in the last 12 weeks, right? And so I'm going to talk about the fallacy of the three nines. So, 3 nines is being up 99.9% of the time that your app is up. And, I have had a number of, I would say, discussions with some IT leads who run production that, they're, you said it earlier, Rob, are they hiding behind their happy stats? And the stat they don't want to track is these things that I would call brownouts, where CPU's maxed at 100% and nobody can do anything, or memory's maxed at 100% running some crazy off the rails query that the app generated, and all the users logged in at both of those times can't do anything. And so I want to know, here's the formula I want, which is number of seconds this brownout occurred times the number of users logged in at that time. Give me the number. Right? Nobody wants to show that number and graph it over the course of a month, because that in and of itself, it's a critical problem that often goes unresolved because of the IT guys say, well, the brownout's over, we're good. Well, until it happens, at 2 o'clock on Thursday. And that is a source of incredible frustration for users. And so, they don't just lose trust in, the IT team, they lose trust in your company. And, production's the only one of the things on this list that I've talked about so far where you don't get deposits. You only get withdrawals. Production running seamlessly it's like air. It's just expected to be there all the time. And if it's not running well, you're making withdrawals, and those withdrawals are big and expensive ones. And again, this is not one of those issues that's just IT, because when these things happen, it becomes a CS issue, a support issue. Your NPS takes a hit, your CSAT takes a hit, and ultimately it becomes a retention issue and a boardroom issue. So this is an area where folks really need to be strong. And that means sometimes re-architecture of the software, because maybe it wasn't designed for the volume of users that are now logging in, right?
So when Eric was developing the model, I begged him to say, let me add a couple of areas that near and dear to my heart that became part of the whole turnaround aspect. And we talked about early on, and Eric mentioned how you have to integrate customer success into everything else. And one of the major things in several turnarounds I've been in is really training in enablement. And this is an area, and I don't want to turn this into a griping session either. I can't tell you how many organizations don't invest in, they do the manual, or it's online, it's there. They have an LMS and it's all in the LMS, and that stuff is not aligned with the actual product itself. And so you go in, I got to figure this out. And even from my own personal perspective, because my organization, we built a pretty sophisticated platform that has many, many components to diagnose organizations. And the challenges that we had is, the documentation for the stuff we were cutting edge was way out of date. So it's a huge issue, and training and enablement, you get this right. And don't forget, whether we're living, maybe it's sunset time for Google search. I think it's going to be around for a while, but your Google is indexing your training materials if you made them public. So when people Google, how do I fix XYZ, they're gonna they may get the wrong stuff. And it gets even worse where the AI systems, if they're basically training based on your information, suddenly you can ask the questions. Well, I'm not going to Google it. I'm just going to tell it. I'm going to ask AI how to fix it, and it's telling you how to fix it based on stuff that isn't aligned. So, again, a customer success. Quick thought on that, Eric?
Yeah, it's a tricky one, Rob, because you've got so little control over what Google's indexing, right?
Yeah.
So I think leaning back into I LMSs are definitely not my strong area, but I suspect that AI is going to change the complexity with getting those things and keeping them up to date.
Yeah, we certainly,
Um,
that's a
in,
great
in
point.
in the next, I mean, we're talking about AI like everybody's doing it. Everybody's not doing AI. If they're doing it, they're probably doing it mediocre at best right now.
Yeah.
Most companies.
Yeah, exactly. I think
Uh,
this is low hanging fruit for the LMSs, and I'll throw a rock at LMSs. Everybody thinks it's a panacea. It's there, it's good, and we'll use happy stats for how many people are accessing our LMS. And at the end of the day, it's tough. And then the final piece is sales and marketing. Having run sales, I've gotten calls from my customer success person leader saying, "Hey, Rob, your team sold something that doesn't necessarily exist yet, or they had access to the roadmap." And so the accuracy of setting expectations. So, Eric, you've never seen a roadmap sale before. So, this is
I know.
hey, and then we'll
Uh,
we'll just adjust to it, which turns the success team on its head, and then the engineering team has to turn around and scramble, and maybe they're rushing a fee. This is just a bad cycle. So I think when I'm working with my sales and marketing people, yeah, it's a competitive situation. You may be lacking things. There's time to use a roadmap, but if you sell the roadmap, you may be turning without the proper expectations. This may become a problem. So yet another thing we witness. So as we move forward, we've talked about the maturity model, and once the maturity model is in place, Eric, let's talk about how do we build the teams around it, and what do we need to do?
yeah, I mean the previous incantation of customer success, and I'm going to only talk about the customer success team itself here, not the support team and not the professional services team. I'll hint at those at the end before I get to the next slide. But in an AI augmented world that we're all now living in, you just need um, more multi-tiered, multi-skilled folks in your CS organization because there's just more and different things to do than just talk to customers like in the quote old days, right? Like 2023. Um, you still need strategic CSMs to talk to your high stakes customers. They need to be able to provide that level of white glove service that everybody hopes they're getting, especially if they're at that level. You still need a scaled CSM to do that sort of mid touch where they're doing occasional white glove work. Um, in my world, both of those groups of CSMs are delivering that 3x3 matrix to the product team, and most or all of the strategic customers are having those discussions with product, and a handful of potential expansion level customers, probably from this scaled CSM team, are pulled into that group because there's just going to be too many scaled customers eventually to be able to play that game. And obviously, you need someone to do the digital work, and then more importantly, in this AI world, you need a CS ops lead who's got technical chops, who can manage all the systems that you guys are using, build your run books, all the processes around how to use those, and then drive the AI architecture that you're going to end up using. And that is probably a conversation between that person, your CTO, maybe your engineering leader, so that you can figure out as a company, what overall AI strategy is for the business. I think burning tons of resources would be let all your functional teams go build up their own AI strategy.
Yeah. And Eric, there's a question. You've talked about scale several times. It's question is about how do you scale a customer success organization without losing the personal touch? And that seems to be, I've witnessed that with a lot of organizations. Yeah, what's your secret?
It's difficult, and part of it is to get those relationships established through the onboarding process. So in the early days of a customer coming on board, there should be a lot of touch points for that customer, knowing full well that at some point they may fall into the digital leads role where they're only getting a couple touches a year. That's okay. But if you've established a great relationship, and maybe they just don't generate enough revenue, you got to give them that kind of attention. You've got to build that trusted relationship, and your opportunity to do that is after they go through onboarding. And so I like to see a weekly cadence for at least 90 days. If you fit into one of the upper segments, that weekly touch might go on for a bit longer, and then break down to something that's more palatable for both you and the customer. Because at some point they'll love you, but they're not going to want to talk about your dog anymore on Tuesday morning. I just want to talk about technical versus non-technical. If you have a highly technical product, you may want to try to find more technical resources that sit in these chairs. And honestly, some of those folks are unicorns. In a previous life, I invented this term. This was quite a while ago. Customer success engineer is someone very technical that could go talk with programmers using a product that we sold. And so if they can't have the conversation with the end users that are using the product, it limits the trust you can build. So that may end up being some slight tweaks to job descriptions that are out there. If you've got a very technical product, that's something that's certainly to consider, especially if you're a startup where you can only have a couple of hires in this function at the very beginning. Lean more technical because they'll be able to do more stuff around your tech stack as well.
Speaking of tech stacks,
Tech stacks. So with the direction that AI is headed, data is going to become gold for all things customer facing. And the more data you've got, the more access you have to that data that contains anything about a customer, any interaction with a customer, any sentiment with a customer, meeting notes, et cetera, et cetera. You've got to figure out a way that data can be either in a central repository or you build API calls into the other products that contain it so that you can send AI agents after your data to produce the data that you need. And really be able to build out that 360 view of what's happening with the customer. So that's foundational, at least in my view. And then just moving from the bottom up here, obviously you've got to have a CRM to hold all your marketing and sales information. Typically, in today's world, most of the products that are customer success are sitting on top of those platforms. Gainsight's a great example. Sits on top of Salesforce and Salesforce only. Churn Zero is another one. So, you've got to architect all these platforms so that with the end goal in mind, which is how am I going to get at all this data? Because the more disparate these products are, the more work you're going to have to do to pull all the data into a central location or repository to be able to interrogate it.
Yeah, Eric, is there a tipping point where I have to go and invest, and especially for smaller companies that are under financial pressure, at which point do they go with a Gainsight or some other CSM platform? What's your guidance? At which point do you know you need one?
I think if you're a startup, you probably can't afford Gainsight for quite a while. I mean, that's just the reality. I think if your revenue's under 10 million, Gainsight's probably a luxury. You can certainly do all the things that Gainsight's going to support for you without the AI elements. Because Gainsight very wisely made an AI acquisition in the last, I think, 3 or 4 months. That's enabling generation of that 360 view. So if you're you can certainly replicate that. And, we've, well, maybe not, we've all worked at smart startups. Certainly you and I have worked at startups, but we've had to do guerrilla warfare against some of these problems because we just didn't have the funding, right?
Yeah.
And so there's ways to overcome that. Um, but I would say, you have to have a platform to track support tickets. You have to have a platform to track your sales and marketing stuff, right? You just do. Um, and then the things, as you get further up this list, I think as you get bigger, maybe 10 to 20 million, that's when you can start looking at these things, seeing if budgetarily they make sense. And so, yeah, the ultimate goal here isn't just to automate all this stuff. It's to get alignment on all the things in that, all those different disparate teams, how they're affecting your customer sentiment, and how much trust you have, how easily they're going to be willing to continue to do business with you and expand their business with you.
Yeah, yeah, it's interesting, looking at the whole, we have tech stacks and customer success, we have tech stacks in sales, we have tech stacks in marketing, and one of the things I see quite frequently now is, what organizations are now saying, and do I have too much debt here? Tech stack debt. And so, especially in some of the other areas, it's like if we're going to invest in the tools, they got to do the right thing. But also, and we'll cover this in just a moment, is that, is there an overarching tool? Because the other challenge that we have is silification. If all these tools are siloed, are we losing value? Or can the aside from saying, hey, let's take all these siloed tools and pull all the metrics out for the weekly management meeting, but the reality is we're not necessarily leveraging the data across here. And this is where AI may have a play. I'm getting this from my sales stack, this from my marketing stack, this from that. So these are some of the things that we may want to think about.
Yeah, I mean, you're spot on. And the last business I was at, I took on the role to do customer 360. And to be perfectly blunt, when we first started doing it, it was completely manual. Someone had to literally log into all these systems. And through that process, you know, I serviced that. Oh, by the way, we have 4 ticketing systems for engineering alone, 4 different ticketing systems. So you want to find out what customer X said about bugs across your 4 products. Well, you got to go look at 4 different instances of the ticketing system.
Yeah, and this
Just
raises
to,
the important point for those of you listening involved in mergers and acquisitions. Oftentimes, they sound really good, but what ends up happening, your merger and acquisition isn't just about product; it's about various tech stack, and that has its own challenges. All right, Eric, so we're going to just pop a couple more, and as we wrap up here, I think it's Eric mentioned many times the role of AI in terms of, okay, great, let's use AI internally to basically drive a better customer experience. And Eric, you can throw a rock at me because in some respects that's aspirational and that's where we should be. But some of the behavior that I'm seeing as I've gone with various, with the clients that I'm dealing with, is I'm seeing them using AI when customer success doesn't meet the expectations. And just a couple things highlighted here is is Chat GPT becoming your customer success and support organization? And for a lot of companies, the answer is yeah, it is. And is that good or bad? Well, some of the things we highlight here, are they self-diagnosing issues? Okay. And where's it pulling? We mentioned earlier, if it's being trained off of your LMS and your website, okay, the diagnosis might not, be really good. And if your marketing organization is coming up short, then suddenly it's understanding product and features and how to use them because again, it's supplanting customer success. Are we using AI? And I am guilty of this. And I don't want to say guilty in an apologetic way, but the systems that I've had to use as I built my stuff out is we had to generate workarounds because the products came up short, they didn't integrate well, and AI helped there. And let's not forget, Eric, you talked earlier about, I'm going to use AI to evaluate my alternatives. If I'm having a lousy customer experience, okay, and then my friends at Perplexity and all the various other, I'm calling them up saying, hey, I'm querying them saying, hey, what's happening here? And then this becomes important. I think also, relying on your user communities with AI, who can I connect to? And that's good and that's bad. And then ultimately build their knowledge base, around AI because customer success. So Eric, thoughts here?
Yeah, I mean, it's it's an interesting conundrum. Like your internal teams are now probably fully enabled to use ChatGPT and its friends to solve problems on behalf of customers. And it is it is going to turn into a very large masking agent over the issues that I called out in the previous slide. If you've got a quality issue, well, you can ask ChatGPT to give you a workaround that's pretty decent, right? But does that mean the quality issue doesn't get fixed? Probably,
Yeah.
because if you got a good enough answer, all the problem just lingers, and your customer, frustration grows. Maybe not as quickly as if the issue was unresolved or the workaround wasn't maybe as good as ChatGPT can provide, but you're on the slope to high frustration is what you're on,
Yeah. Is
unfortunately.
there a way, Eric, I mean, I'll go in when your things are on fire. Is there a way because the customer success organization is oftentimes the front line, is there a way for you to detect that this is going on and for you folks to intervene? What would your guidance be?
Yeah, I mean, there's plenty of stats that you can use to detect this stuff's happening. I mean, bug counts is one of them. On my little brownout chart that I mean, I've never seen a production operations team build that chart because they don't want to be held accountable for it, to be honest. So I want to see those two things, and then the feature piece. Um, that's a discussion I think that happens with CS teams, and that just gets surfaced as part
Yeah,
of some analysis.
but can you tell that, if a call comes in or a customer has a query, can you tell that they're kind of using AI to get around? Is there early detection on the customers using AI to so it can
Yeah, I don't know of a way to do that today, Rob. Um, it's an interesting question. I don't know. I don't think there's a way to tell at the moment.
Yeah. No, that's I think it's difficult. I don't know anybody who's done it. And we'll see. All right, just that we're almost close to wrapping up, folks, and there's a couple questions that came in. So in terms of next steps, the reality is your customer success is a foundation for competitive advantage. And when we talk about growth and we talk about go to market, it's important. So some of the closing thoughts here, as Eric mentioned, assessing your customer service maturity first becomes a big deal. And Eric, what I really liked is not all organizations are equal. If you're a startup, maturity is one area. There's an emphasis here. If you're a bigger organization, it's here, but you've got to know where you stand. And I see so many organizations that just they don't know where they are right now, and they don't see the maturity model or even a comparable to make it. So yeah, that's going to be an important point. The other things that we see and we emphasize is that customer success issues may not be customer success issues. And if there's some takeaways here is yes, sure, you want to invest in your organization, but don't assume that it's there. Um, if you don't have the expertise, feel free to reach out to an expert like Eric to say, yeah, how do we fix this? What are the starting points? Because there are people out there, and I think a lot of great customer success people. There's not as many as we all hope, but the ones that are advising become a big deal. And if you feel it's a broader issue, certainly you get a much more, I would say, diagnostic perspective. I see too many organizations kind of looking in the rearview mirror and determining, but you want to be in front of the problem. And we also see that there's Eric mentioned CSM platforms are now marketing their AI, and whether it's organic or, as Eric mentioned, via acquisition. But you've got to look at AI differently. You got to look at AI as a way to integrate and see things across the systems because they'll get better insight. And as you plan your go to market, whether it's going to be part of sales, everything else, customer success, you have to be thinking in terms of customer success. You may not call it customer success, but organizations should meet with their CS leaders. So other closing thoughts, Eric, on some of the key elements and what has historically kept you up at night and how you fixed it.
Yeah, I mean, we think of customer success as a department, but it's not just a department. It's really a trust engine, i.e., your growth engine. And that trust isn't built once; it's reinforced with every touch point with every one of your internal teams, from sales and marketing to onboarding to support, production operations, product. And if you're embedding trust in every one of those layers, you're not just going to retain your customers. You're going to have an incredible competitive advantage against all your competitors that's nearly impossible to take away
Yeah, that makes
because
sense.
those competitors are not building these levels of trust. They're just not.
Okay. All right. We got time for a couple of questions that came in. And somebody like you talked about product and customer success teams. Um, we didn't, we talk about product development. And I think that's part of it, but I'm also seeing some challenges with product management. So this product could be the development, management, or both. So you talked about the example, when you and I worked together, how well we did, product and turning it around, but that may be is that out of the reach of organizations? What can, I would say a customer success leader do to facilitate what you saw with product leadership that you and I experienced previously?
It's a really interesting question, Rob. I think most. I mean, I'm a bit of a unicorn. I started my life as an engineer. I worked as a product manager for a while. Early days out of college, I did QA. So I mean, I've had most of the jobs between eh, the customer and the engineer's chair. Um, and so as a unicorn, the value that someone who's talking to the customer, I really understand how valuable that is to the product team. And there are a lot of CS leaders who they've come up either on the sales side, they've come up on the sales side or on the marketing side, and it's a bit of a blind spot for them. And so, can they do it? They can, but someone's got to show them where the blind spot is. And
Yeah.
and frankly, the the chief product officer or the product leads have to either enforce or strongly request that those conversations are taking place and that they want to go have those conversations with the customers. I work with some product teams who like I have to talk to a customer, ick. And I'm like, oh, you realize you build software for the customers, right? So, I mean, there's definitely some resistance there that can be overcome. But I think, it just takes the will to go do it and then go execute.
Yeah, that's a fair point. And another question came in on the marketing side, and I'll, talk about marketing leaders understanding customer success in order to better support retention. So I'll address this one as our final question. I took grief many years ago, and Eric, I'm not sure you know this. I actually had some of when I onboarded marketing people and I built marketing teams, I had them spend time in two areas, usually a week at a time. And my CEOs didn't like this, but at the end they loved it. Is one, I'd have 1 week spent in inside sales. And not necessarily doing inside sales, but helping inside sales and listening to the calls. The other week was spent, in customer success. And so they get, not only did they see how the product sold, I wanted the marketers to see what was happening on the front end, but also on the back end, they became much better marketers. And the challenge I'll put out to marketing teams, if if you're not, if you're in an organization, you got a great product, but if you are not marketing your customer success function, then something's wrong. And I would say, let's go back to your three nines, Eric. Okay. I would say 999 organizations out of 1,000 aren't doing that. And so, we talked about customer success as a growth engine, which was a topic of our call, but in many respects, it can be your competitive advantage. And if you're not marketing that, you're basically in the wrong spot. So, Eric, that's going to wrap up our time. So I've got my contact information and Eric's contact information here. You can reach us, both of us, via the phone number I have listed there. And if there's any questions, by all means, we'll be sending some stuff out to the people who've registered for the call, or we'll also put something when we post the video in the link how to reach us. If you need guidance from Eric and advisory role, looking at your organization, he can be available for that in his in basically his capacity. And if there's a diagnostic, we can talk about that. And oftentimes, as I mentioned, when we open this up, it's when I go in an organization, my role is to diagnose, but when I see a customer success issue, I know my call is to Eric to help the organization out. So, Eric, want to say big thanks for the call. This has been great. This has been a masterclass in customer success, and I would say in contemporary customer success. And Eric, you're putting it in context for us, and then throwing the AI salt on this, really makes it important. So thank you for that.
Yeah, appreciate it. It was a lot of fun.
Okay, thanks, folks. All right, bye bye.